No one noticed the flicker above the chandeliers or the half-second flattening of the music's resonance in the Lydian hall. Conversations hummed along polished surfaces, crystal glasses clinked with curated ease, and laughter was measured in the same unit as legacy. But one sentence dropped like a pin into velvet. "Excuse me, housekeeping." The ripple of indulgent amusement that followed was slow, deliberate. Its origin a woman draped in crimson silk, pearls curved like privilege across her collarbone. Petra Bellingham didn't glance at the target of her remark. She didn't have to. The assumption was designed to travel without direct aim. Zuri Caldwell stood at the periphery of the central arch, perfectly still. No embroidery adorned her dress, no emblem on her wrist. Just an emerald wrap, well cut and unbranded, and a closed leather folio in her grasp. Her expression didn't flicker. She didn't smile. She didn't scan for validation. Petra's circle barely concealed their amusement. One man tapped his flute against another's in mock salute. "Didn't know the service staff were briefing tonight," he murmured. Another added under his breath, "Bit far from the kitchen entrance, isn't she?" Zuri made no reply. Her silence wasn't passive. It was practiced. A single swipe across her folio's edge registered no more drama than brushing dust from a sleeve. But something shifted. Across the room, a young staff photographer paused mid-frame. His lens, aimed at a commissioned floral sculpture, tilted instinctively toward the woman in green. The quartet continued their chamber piece, but the tempo faltered by half a beat. No one stopped talking, but something, subtle and internal, slid out of sync. Zuri hadn't moved. She hadn't returned the insult or even acknowledged it. Yet already the geometry of the evening had bent ever so slightly. It was in the weight of a pause, the stagger in a server's step, the sudden lack of clarity in conversations that had, moments ago, flowed like scripted theater. She didn't ask to be seen. But the room had started to look anyway. A subtle hesitation took hold, not loud enough to fracture the evening, but precise enough to shave polish off its edges. Petra Bellingham continued to sip her drink, confident in the room's alignment, yet unaware that it had already begun to tilt. The music, though uninterrupted, felt thinner, less like ambience and more like decor trying too hard to fill a silence it hadn't prepared for. Zuri Caldwell remained where she stood, unhurried, untouched by the performance unraveling across the room. She did not scan the crowd or raise her chin in defiance. Instead, her gaze rested, not on Petra, but slightly beyond, as though tracing the future shape of an evening that had just changed texture. Leo Tanaka, the youngest on the event staff, lingered for a half-second longer near a tray station. He wasn't close enough to hear the exact words, but the way the string ensemble hesitated, the way eyes shifted in Zuri's direction, told him something unspoken had taken precedence over protocol. He didn't write anything down. He didn't need to. His lens was always open. Near the eastern bar, Carmen Rivas stopped shooting table decor and redirected her camera slightly. The woman in emerald hadn't made a scene, hadn't drawn a single spotlight. Yet somehow the focal point of the room had changed. Carmen adjusted her settings. Whatever this was, it wasn't fashion. It was structure. At the main security post, Omar Winfield didn't move, but he did reposition his weight. Not out of suspicion, there was no breach, but out of experience. Years in elite event protection had taught him to watch the moments when nothing seemed wrong, yet every molecule of air began to behave differently. He narrowed his eyes, not at Zuri, but at the pattern forming around her. The guests didn't freeze. They didn't gasp or gather. But their gestures, picking up a napkin, sipping from a glass, leaning toward a conversation, became incrementally less fluid, like an orchestra whose conductor had walked off stage mid-measure. They didn't know what they were waiting for, but they were waiting. Zuri still hadn't spoken. Her posture was easy, her attention steady. The insult hadn't injured her. It had clarified her purpose. She had become, without declaration, the axis around which the room's balance began to recalculate. Not through confrontation, through composure. And in that recalibration, something ancient stirred, an instinct honed in boardrooms and whispered about in shareholder retreats. The realization that real shifts never begin with volume. They begin with the absence of it. And Zuri Caldwell, motionless at the edge of the atrium, was no longer the subject of a joke. She was the beginning of a correction. Zuri's feet hadn't moved. Her folio remained closed, her hands relaxed. But something deeper had started to echo, quietly, persistently, beneath the crystal sheen of the Lydian hall. It wasn't attention she commanded. It was orientation. One by one, people began turning not because they were invited to, but because their sense of the room had subtly recalibrated. Petra Bellingham adjusted her bracelet without meaning to. The gesture was habitual, automatic, a motion born of entitlement, of always being watched and rewarded for the smallest flourish. Yet tonight, it drew no gaze. The shimmer of her pearls no longer signaled center. Something had intercepted the spotlight she once assumed permanent. Near the front dais, a logistics executive paused in mid-conversation, his fingers hovering above a screen meant for sponsor acknowledgments. The names blurred for a moment. His colleague tilted her head, eyes darting briefly toward Zuri before looking away, as if caught glimpsing a gravitational shift she hadn't given herself permission to understand. Leo Tanaka resumed his movement, but slower now. Not sluggish, cautious. He wasn't carrying just stemware anymore. He was navigating atmosphere. Zuri hadn't given him instructions, hadn't even acknowledged him. Yet something in her posture, in her silence, felt like a line he didn't want to cross blindly. At the hall's western edge, a hedge fund coordinator rechecked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The time hadn't changed significantly, but the evening had. His instincts, trained on fluctuations of capital and reputation, had picked up on the soft tremor that always precedes exposure. He folded his napkin too carefully, like he wanted to signal alertness without revealing concern. Carmen Rivas zoomed out slightly. The tighter frames weren't working anymore. This wasn't a portrait of a moment. It was a system being disrupted. Zuri wasn't acting. She wasn't even reacting. She was holding. Holding silence like a scalpel, holding space like a fulcrum. And in that steadiness, Carmen recognized something rarer than scandal. She recognized control. Omar Winfield's earpiece buzzed faintly. Not an alert, just a check-in from external protocol. He didn't reply right away. His focus was now divided between the access list and the pattern unfolding in real time. He had worked hundreds of events, enforced countless boundaries. But this shift didn't come from outside. It was blooming from within. And Zuri, standing where she began, hadn't issued a single challenge. She didn't need to. Her silence had moved past resistance and entered a different register altogether, observation as indictment. She was measuring how power responded to discomfort. And so far the room was failing the test. Petra Bellingham descended 2 steps from the dais like she had timed the moment to precision. Her heels didn't clack. They whispered command. In her hand, gripped just delicately enough to imply theatrical disdain, fluttered a torn piece of thick stationery. The gold-embossed seal of Bellingham Evers Holdings gleamed under the hall's lighting, while the bottom half, ripped clean, bore the faint outline of a name now half erased. She raised it slightly, not toward Zuri, but just high enough for nearby guests to notice. The gesture was slow, curated, not about confrontation, but composition. Petra didn't say anything right away. She didn't need to. The implication rode ahead of her like perfume. This woman doesn't belong. Zuri didn't flinch. Her gaze didn't shift. She didn't acknowledge the paper or the woman wielding it like a verdict. Her poise was not resistant. It was diagnostic. Petra thought she was delivering a message. What she was actually doing was revealing insecurity. Around them, the social current began to break apart. Conversations fragmented into sharper whispers. A legal advisor in the second row shifted seats slightly, creating a half-inch more distance between himself and Petra's circle. It wasn't an alliance yet, but it wasn't loyalty either. The room had entered a gray zone. Carmen Rivas didn't move her lens from the tableau. She widened her frame. The story wasn't just Zuri anymore. It was the arrangement itself. Petra's posture, the torn document, the cluster of half-curious guests pretending not to watch. She didn't need to caption it. The image would speak in every edit room that understood power as choreography. Omar Winfield tensed slightly, not with threat, but with pattern recognition. The prop, the silence, the spacing, it was too deliberate. He had seen it before in rooms where decorum was weaponized instead of language. He checked the position of his team, subtly nodding toward the mezzanine. It wasn't security he was watching. It was temperature. Leo Tanaka caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. His tray remained level, but his camera, small, tucked in a side pocket, was already turned on. He wasn't sure why yet, only that something was breaking open, and if he waited for permission to document it, he'd be late. And through it all, Zuri stood in full silence, as if Petra's display wasn't an attack, but a weather pattern. She hadn't countered the insult, hadn't defended her place, because she wasn't protecting position. She was observing collapse, and it had just begun. From the far end of the gallery, Reginald Bellingham appeared, not with urgency, but with the steady confidence of someone who believed presence alone resolved tension. He didn't glance at Petra. He didn't address the scrap of paper in her hand. His eyes locked directly on Zuri Caldwell, as if expecting compliance through eye contact alone. When he spoke, his voice was soft, smooth with generational polish. "You may be in the wrong section," he said. There was no malice in the delivery, just a calibrated undercurrent, the kind that reminded others of the long history behind a name. But beneath the surface, the words carried a weight meant to isolate. Zuri didn't move. She didn't correct him. The corner of her folio remained against her hip, untouched. Yet her silence, so consistent and intentional, had evolved. It was no longer just a refusal to participate. It had become a mechanism, a force unto itself. The room began to fold differently. Two attendees from a regional maritime bank paused mid-toast. One lowered her glass without completing the motion. The other checked his phone, then immediately set it face down again. Neither had spoken, but both had pulled back their energy from the space between Petra and Zuri, as if unsure which narrative would survive the next 10 minutes. Omar Winfield took one deliberate step forward. Not aggressive, not overt. Just enough to remind the room that observation wasn't the same as absence. He didn't address anyone. He didn't touch his earpiece. But his body now created a line, thin, invisible, and unmistakable, between dominance assumed and dominance earned. Carmen's camera caught the shift in Reginald's jaw, the half-second where his expectation met an unexpected friction. It was the expression of a man trained to direct rooms who had suddenly realized the floor wasn't following the choreography. Her shutter didn't click. She captured the moment silently. Leo Tanaka felt it too. Not just in Zuri's stillness, but in the way Petra's fingers now held the torn paper less like a symbol and more like a miscalculation. The atmosphere didn't escalate, but it recalculated. Every detail, angle, posture, breath, became data in motion. And Zuri, without declaring anything, had begun to tilt the calculus of alignment. No one cheered. No one shifted sides loudly. But the power had changed hands. Not because Zuri demanded it, but because everyone in the room had already started behaving like it had happened. And by the time Reginald Bellingham finished blinking, the room was no longer his to command. Inside her earpiece, Zuri Caldwell heard a voice, calm, prepared. Initial clearances processed, protocol confirmed, awaiting your mark. She didn't respond with words. Just a single tap against the folio's edge, one that neither caught attention nor sought it. Yet in that moment, an invisible shift began to ripple outward. Across the venue, a managing director from Sutterly Freight checked his device and frowned. The dashboard he monitored, a set of real-time equity indicators, had just reflected an unannounced change. A partner withdrawal, clean and final. His glass lowered without conscious thought. His posture shifted. Carmen Rivas captured the scene from a wide angle now. She was no longer following individual movement. She was framing a transformation. Nothing about Zuri had grown louder, but everything else had quieted, like a system recognizing the authority of new software running in the background. Reginald Bellingham checked his watch, but the motion was hollow. The moment he had introduced himself into had already moved past him. People weren't reacting to his voice anymore. They were reacting to the void behind it. His name hadn't lost value. It had lost momentum. Omar Winfield now tracked movement not near Zuri, but around her. Conversations that should have been unrelated began adjusting tone. Guests in unrelated sectors now exchanged looks. Something structural, not social, had taken root. He tapped his shoulder mic once. No words, just confirmation of alert posture. Leo Tanaka's phone buzzed. One, then twice. Private feeds from market groups he followed began lighting up. Nothing dramatic. No press alert. But the type of movement that seasoned analysts called institutional cold. Silent repositioning. A new gravitational center identified. And Zuri's name didn't need to be on screen to be involved. Petra stood frozen now. Not from fear, but from confusion wrapped in vanity. She was waiting for the room to recenter around her. But the coordinates had changed. She held a piece of torn paper in her hand, unaware it now resembled not evidence, but irrelevance. Zuri's second tap came without ceremony. The voice in her ear responded, "Transition finalized. External alert staggered. Marigold deployment verified." No one in the room heard it, but every financial echo chamber outside had already begun responding. The disruption wasn't performative, it was complete. The unraveling didn't begin with an outburst. It began at the margins, where the overlooked always see first. A junior strategist from one of the venue's side tables leaned over her phone, eyes scanning a quiet headline. No banner, no drama, just a transfer confirmation. Bellingham Evers Holdings replaced. Effective immediately. The phrasing was clinical, surgical, and yet its implications struck deeper than scandal. Petra hadn't seen it yet, but others had. A logistics investor lowered his champagne flute mid-toast. His smile didn't drop, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. He was recalculating. Reginald Bellingham adjusted his tie, not because it had moved, but because something had. He didn't speak. His instincts told him any noise now would only emphasize the silence already taking root. He had seen deals collapse before, but never from the inside out. Zuri Caldwell hadn't moved, but the room's alignment had shifted so completely that standing still now read like strategy, not stillness. Conversations detoured, introductions rerouted. Her silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was the blueprint of realignment. Carmen Rivas turned slowly from the central space toward the mezzanine. There, near the velvet railing, stood Isadora King. She wasn't smiling. She didn't need to. Her presence, silent, regal, and sharply noted, meant only one thing. Marigold wasn't planning. Marigold was present. Omar Winfield caught the shift immediately, not in volume, but in gaze. Executives who once followed Petra's motion now flicked glances toward the rear vestibule, where new conversations had begun forming. Quiet, fast, deliberate. The kind of motion that followed certainty. Leo Tanaka looked down at his personal feed. 3 updates in succession, each tied to quietly rerouted capital. The pace of change was no longer speculative. It was applied, And Zuri, still standing where she had always been, was no longer unexplained. She was confirmed. The Bellinghams didn't leave, but they no longer led. Petra's fingers still held the torn program, but the hand had lost its pose. Reginald's presence, once used as leverage, had become a reminder of a center that no longer held. And Zuri, calm, precise, undisturbed, was now the point around which every remaining decision turned. The elevator made no sound as it rose, its glass walls offering nothing but diffused light. Zuri Caldwell stood alone inside, no phone in hand, no expression of urgency. 31 floors above the murmur of the Lydian Hall, she arrived not to be noticed. She arrived to proceed. The boardroom was minimalist, sharp. A single walnut table stretched across the mat space. No flowers, no crest, no performance. The projection wall displayed live data flow, transactional confirmation, capital reallocation, compliance locks already secured. No one stood to greet her. They had already adjusted hours ago. To her left, the compliance director nodded once. To her right, the operations lead passed her a single interface panel. Marigold had moved in complete silence. Bellingham Evers was now absent not in name, but in function. No statements had been made. The shift didn't require ceremony. Zuri reviewed, confirmed, and approved. Her actions bore no flair, no pauses for effect. What needed to be done had already been orchestrated. The hall below still shimmered in crystal and linen, but the gravity had lifted. Petra and Reginald weren't adversaries now, they were simply irrelevant. On her desk sat a small object recently delivered, encased beneath a clear glass slab, the torn program, flattened and preserved. No caption, no triumph, just record. It didn't mock, it documented. Systems don't collapse from attacks. They erode when the support structure decides it's no longer worth the correction. Zuri didn't linger. She didn't issue a summary. Her team would follow. Her path was already calibrated to the next unresolved structure waiting its quiet correction. Because influence, once understood properly, never needs to repeat itself. It simply continues forward. Outside, the city grid flickered like a motherboard, pulses of light crawling between towers. But Zuri's attention wasn't drawn to height or glow. It stayed focused on structure, the actual pathways where decisions are made before they are seen. She didn't announce victory. She didn't even claim presence. But the institutions now realigned behind her understood one thing. Zuri Caldwell had never been part of the performance. She was the recalibration. And the room, without ever hearing her voice, would never forget what followed when she chose to stand. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been misread, minimized, or underestimated before you even arrived, then you understand this. True influence doesn't raise its voice. It realigns the room. It moves through silence, through clarity, through knowing exactly when to act. This is a fictional story. Any resemblance to real people, companies, or events is purely coincidental. Subscribe if these stories speak to you. Here, we don't follow the noise. We follow the shift.